Okay, everyone, we are going to start our panel. I hope you enjoyed your coffee. Okay, everyone, I believe we can start our panel on decolonialism, lessons of the past and challenges of the present. My name is Martin Kisui. I am a historian of Crimea and Crimean Tatars. And today we will have a panel. We will start it with a keynote speech by Mridula Ghosh. And after the keynote speech, we will have a discussion with our panelists. Mr. Ali Maliyev, Crimean Tatar activist and deputy head of Ukrainian Institute. Dr. Marat Ilyasov, scholar from Chechen scholar, visiting scholar at George Washington University in US. He will join us online via Zoom. Felix Mardiaga, academic and former presidential candidate and president of Nicaraguan Freedom Foundation. Dr. Batakas Kasambekova, assistant professor of modern history at the University of Basel. Reverend Madihai Tambiana Wampo, chief executive officer at the AGAP Humanitarian Outreach, convener of a democratic pressure group, Arise Ghana, and lead convener of political activist group Justice for Ghana. I will start with a short, brief introduction by myself. I will try to be very brief because we really have plenty of issues to talk about and a lot of questions to ask each other. But I want to frame our panel very, very quick, in a very short manner. 106 years ago, a Congress of the enslaved peoples of Russia was hosted by the Ukrainian parliament here in Kiev on September of 1917. On its first day, the head of Crimean Tatars delegation, Jafer Sidemet, he paid tribute to the hosts and wished success to the Ukrainian movement. Simon Petlura, the head of Ukrainian government, replied in turn, I firmly believe that Russia stands on the brink of death when it does not turn to the living sources of the nation that comprise it. All of us, Ukrainians, Crimean Tatars, and all others are great nations. Unfortunately, Bolsheviks won the war. And for Ukrainians as well for Crimean Tatars and many other nations of the former Russian Empire, the Soviet rule was highlighted by tragic events. 20th century was an age of genocides and neocolonialism provided by Soviet Union. By the moment this Congress of enslaved people of Russia happened, Crimea was occupied for more than a century by Russia. The Russian annexation of Crimea in 1783 began the history of Russian presence in the peninsula. And this process of incorporation of the peninsula into the Russian Empire, it was slow and happened through the 19th century, a century of colonization in the history of Western European empires. The history of Russian imperial control over Crimea through the 19th century shared many of the Western settler colonial practices. Crimean Tatars were often portrayed as wild, uncivilized, poorly organized, aggressive societies that needed guidance from more advanced powers. In the manifesto that proclaimed the annexation of the peninsula, Catherine II justified the takeover with the inability of Crimean Tatars to govern themselves. Thus, she followed a narrative that Western empires used to justify colonization. I want to pass the word to Mridula for a keynote speech that will frame our panel and focus on the issues we were going to talk about. The floor is yours. It's turned on. It's already on. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. As keynote speaker, I probably will have to highlight certain aspects of the topic in general, and I would not like to go very deep into it, but unfortunately I have to start with this very strange perception that we are starting to discuss something which people discuss in the 19th century, phenomenon which should not happen today in the 20th century. Sadly, Ukraine unfortunately had to pass through these processes which resulted in these tragic events, and that has laid bare the whole essence of what colonialism is. Ukraine, to be frank, was not even seen as a proper country. I would not even hesitate to say that, because in my personal experience, many times I come from India, I stay and work in Ukraine. Many times I was asked, where do you stay? When I asked Ukraine, I said, okay, you are in Russia. So that was a shock for me, but I had to keep that shock within me. The language, the same thing. Ukrainian, is there a language really? I mean, this was the perception of another part of the world where I belong to. In spite of these personal experiences, we know that 24th February 2022 is that date which has made the world rethink about many things. First of all, Ukrainians started thinking about many things. If before, Ukrainians were hesitant to talk about colonialism from their perspective, I had discussions with a lot of academics, a lot of politicians, that they were very hesitant to think of even colonialism affecting Ukraine back during the Soviet times. However, today it is acknowledged by every Ukrainian that what they are passing through is a war of decolonization and a war of liberation. Ukrainians have been fighting this war since 1991, and even maybe before. Some would even say that they have been fighting this for 300 or 400 years. But to put it, in a more reasonable framework, I would say that 2014, with the occupation of Crimea, the signal for decolonization becomes very open. An occupation of Crimea sets the tone for decolonization. And the war that started in 2022 made it open. Now, the problems of understanding Ukraine, I will just say a few words. That's the perception. It's in the mental map of Ukraine, mental map of every person. What is the place of Ukraine? There is a historical inertia everybody suffered from. And there is the Russocentric historiography, Russocentric stereotypes. As a result, we had what? We had under-appreciation, undervalued, ignored, and sometimes taken for granted. Together with it, even in the Western universities, including even, in the universities of what we call Global South, there is very little intellectual inquiry and public discourse. And what can we expect from the policymakers? We hardly can expect anything. And please add to that the grand bulldozer. What is the grand bulldozer? That is the Russian media and soft power, which is there to sway everything away. And let's take the truth. It's the post-truth war, the wartime extremities, and of course, the humanitarian crisis, what Ukraine goes through. Ukraine's coloniality, academically, is very difficult to trace. It's not a traditional colony that the world thinks of academically. Like, all colonies were in the southern hemisphere, and people, colonial people usually are with dark skin. Unfortunately, there is a very serious racial element in it, but these subaltern Ukrainians were culturally colonized, linguistically colonized, not racially. We have to understand that therefore the marginalization was collective and not necessarily individual. You could see a lot of Ukrainians occupying high posts during the Soviet era, but that does not signify that there was no colonialism, because the marginalization affected large groups. I would not talk about the language discrimination only. There is another subtle note to it, a very psychological note, that is mystifying of Ukraine by Russia bearing what they call it like the white man's burden, we are trying to do something better. We are trying to help the Ukrainians. And there is this imperial narrative which was perpetuated during the Soviet times. And therefore, colonial Ukraine was Little Russia, which today Putin is angry because Putin thinks it's anti-Russia. How can this be? This should always be the Little Russia. Of course, this ambivalence leads to something like, politically imperial, but, it is aesthetically ethnic. Oh, how sweet they are. How sweet they sing songs. This is the role that Ukrainians were given to. I would also say, using the words of a famous Ukrainian academic, Mykola Repchuk, he says, Ukrainians were like the Friday in Robinson Crusoe's, in the story of Robinson Crusoe. Friday remains a good Friday, until Friday is Friday. When Friday demands more, it cannot be allowed. So that was the role ascribed to Ukrainians. In today's rhetoric, we see, therefore, that they are not able to fight. You see, the NATO is fighting on their behalf. Everything is being done by the others. So they are a colony of the West. That is the rhetoric of Putin and his administration. I would point out that here you can find in all the narratives, basically, not only the narratives that Ukrainians are like, they are fighting as Nazis, and they are being like puppets in the hand of the West, and they are stooges. This is something that is emanating out of a great fear of Ukraine searching for its identity and successfully carving it out. And therefore, I come to the conclusion that decolonization is something very different today than we know in textbooks. In textbooks, it was all about the Eurocentric view of decolonization, that is against the West. So most academics in the Global South, they would tend to say, where do we figure decolonization in this? But this is a historic process. And in this historic process, if we think of decolonization, it is decolonizing the mind, first of all. And it starts with the public discourse, the media, and the academia. And that is, something that stopped in the 60s. We think decolonization is over. it is not no more there. But therefore, today's conflict, as it is everywhere said, conflict in Ukraine, let it be like conflict, war, aggressive war, genocide. What is happening is terrible. All these words collectively even do not say what a generation is getting lost. So this is also a process of decolonization and the realization of how to interpret this war and how to build alliances will only show if we are having the decolonization or not. And this is a process of not only preparing a new global architecture, but a new international order. And this was seen, as we remember, with Crimea occupation. The world ignored, honestly. There was nothing substantially done except for sanctions. And until now, we know that we have to liberate Crimea. I was, shocked. I shocked many people in my country, India, as when I said that if you say Crimea is Russian, Crimea is as much Russian as India is British. Because British came to India in 1776. There was a war in 1757, and then the whole process started. So the British Empire has its time, and the conquest of Crimea by Russians were in 1783, as our honorable moderator said already. So thinking from this, when the rhetoric goes that Crimea is Russian and so it must be left to Russia, is greatly, ignoring the simple past and becoming myopic, becoming so short-sighted that it is ignoring the lot of people, territories. And this is something that is even, I would say, a historical crime to be committed. Now, decolonizing wars, this is a decolonizing war. We do not have decolonization peacefully. We are fighting a war. And when we say, like, race is not important in this case, because Ukraine is a multiracial country. Crimea is very much a multiracial, multi-religious, and a very different country. And it is home to the biggest indigenous people in Ukraine, and a very respected community, a community which deserves historical justice. And for the global left, I'm very surprised that, this support to Putin's regime is somewhat tangential to fighting the West. The fighting the West is so much of an obsession for many of these, the leftists. So for them, it is somewhat a very touchy issue to speak in favor of Ukraine as a colonial country which needs to get decolonized. And it's a post-colonial country. I would not say Ukraine is a colony because Ukraine is independent since many years. I think, to sum up, that resilience of the people has shown that what it is to be a post-colonial nation. I also think that the defense and military strategy will also shows that this nation, together, a civic understanding of decolonization is what is happening. Now, what we have is time to think of an alliance of middle powers, alliance of powers that are having some similar status, similar situations, similar problems across the globe, as well as to think of Ukraine's non-aggressive foreign policy. Even today, you can see that Ukraine is not going and occupying Russian territory. Until recently, it was not hitting even Russian territory. So this is a new concept of security, that they are just defending themselves. So Ukraine deserves a lot more than it is today getting. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh, for opening our panel. And I'm proposing to our panelists to share with us and each other their thoughts and reflections on the topic of our panel. their inputs. I believe we can start with Dr. Kasambekova.
Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to be here. It was an amazing experience for me to meet people from around the world, and I think it's a very decolonial moment. And I will start kind of with my biography a little bit, then to come to bigger conclusions about what decolonization could mean practically, I think, for Ukraine, but also for the region. So I grew up in Kazakhstan, and in kind of Soviet schooling, what we learned was mostly about Russia. So I knew from my textbooks more about Moscow than my own city. I knew Russian history, Russian literature much better. So I kind of, every time something happened in Russia, I really empathized and I identified with people there because I was taught to love Russia. Whereas I didn't know much about Kazakhstan, I didn't know much about other cities in Kazakhstan. But a community and a nation lives in stories. We were denied the story about ourselves, so that story didn't exist. So when during the Soviet times, for example, in the 1970s, Kazakh students wanted to write about the hunger that took away 40% of Kazakhs, it was punishable. That story was not allowed to exist in the Soviet times. Those people, those young intellectuals who tried to do that, they were repressed on the basis of nationalism. So the stories were eliminated. In the 90s, people were busy with surviving, so there was not so much time on thinking and reflecting about the story. But what happened was I went to study in Bishkek, which is a neighboring country of Kazakhstan, and there two Ukrainian, actually more, but two Ukrainian students with whom I became friends came also to study to Bishkek. And in late 1990s, that was a very unusual step for Ukrainian students to come to Kyrgyzstan because usually everyone wanted to study in Moscow, everyone wanted to study in the West. So with one of my Ukrainian, important was that, of course, I knew Ukrainian people because there were many Ukrainian people in Kazakhstan, but that was somebody from Ukraine. So I heard a lot of stories about Ukraine. And with one of them, actually with both of them, we co-founded a human rights organization. One of the things that we achieved was releasing a political prisoner in Belarus. Back then in early 2000s, that was still possible. And so we did things together. We were teaching human rights, we were engaged in civic activism, et cetera, et cetera. So we had this very direct connection to Ukraine, and we didn't have this connection to people from Russia. Another thing that, so I studied, I went to study, but then when Ukraine made kind of visa-free travel to Ukraine, when I was teaching in Germany, I brought students, German students to Ukraine. One of the important factors was the release, the opening of KGB archives. And of course, I'm a historian, and that was very attractive. So Russia was not attractive anymore, but Ukraine was attractive simply because there was this process of democratization, that there was this process of opening. So of course, when you go, you make connections. You study the history automatically when you go, when you exchange with each other. So, these connections, these intellectual connections were made, and this was very important during this war. I realized that some of my colleagues who study East European history, they go to study the rest of the region, also to study Central Asia, actually only in Moscow archives. And they didn't go to Ukraine, and it was very difficult for them because they knew Ukraine only from books, and they didn't know Ukraine, they didn't travel to Ukraine. So for them, some of them were silent because they didn't know what to say. I mean, of course, they could say more things, but they couldn't explain the difference between Russia and Ukraine because this experience was lacking. So also, of course, because I was teaching at European universities, there is Erasmus exchange program, which is, financed by European Union, and that is very important to foster exchange between students in Europe. Also, I myself was on a high school exchange program, and I've been to many different countries, so that was a very formative experience. So, given the fact that during the Soviet times, it was a very hierarchical system, so all roads went through Moscow, and we didn't have that many conversations like Kazakhs with Ukrainians, with Uzbeks, with Latvians, etc., etc. What happened now during the full-scale invasion is that intense conversations are taking place. So a very decolonial moment, a grassroots, very spontaneous. People wanted to talk to each other, not through Moscow, but with each other. So one of the things that I realized is very important, because Ukraine is a moral leader of decolonization. Ukraine is a safe space to talk about colonialism. Ukraine is a method in the sense that Ukraine brings all of us together, is actually fostering exchange programs, high school exchange program, university exchange programs. I know that there are a lot of foreign students in Ukraine, because Ukraine is an educational market, but we also need programs where students don't only come by themselves, but also, historians, social scientists, sociologists. We need to foster these connections, personal connections. But it's not only bringing people from around the world to come and experience Ukraine, but also that kind of my experience of having Ukrainian students in Central Asia is also extremely important, to foster these exchange programs, to send students on exchange semesters to countries of Latin America, to countries in Africa, to countries in East Asia. So this is something that is very needed, not only because personal contacts are important, because the thinking will be different. So we are still used to kind of really imperial toolkit, academic toolkit. For example, just to give an example, the word Russia is a colonial word. There is no such thing as Russia. Every time we use the word Russia, we erase the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, we erase Tatarstan, we erase Bashkortostan. However, Russia is that word is being fostered, and we really need, to be careful not to use that word. It's a Russian empire. And so using that word will give justice to the polities that are still colonized by the Russian Empire. But also this kind of fostering this exchange and fostering these connections will allow not simply to talk about some regions, but to craft new knowledges together. So there is kind of one of the important, I think, in the German-speaking kind of academia, is that we don't talk about the people, we talk with the people. So we study ourselves together. And so once we have these exchanges, we will be able to understand ourselves more. So it's not only about simply knowing people, it's about understanding ourselves. So one of the examples, I will say, there was unfortunately, he's not anymore, a great historian, Mark van Hagen. He was a historian of the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire. And one of the things he did in the still in the Soviet period, an unusual thing that he did, he learned Ukrainian. And he said that when he learned Ukrainian as a US professor, it has changed his view of the Soviet Union. And then he wrote an article and explained that Ukraine was colonized. And actually, before he died, I think in 2018, he held one of his last lectures in Germany, where he said that he thinks that Ukraine will be invaded, but by now it will not be by Bolsheviks, it will be by fascists. So simply because he learned Ukrainian, it gave him a totally different picture, totally different understanding of you know, the past, but also he could predict the future very accurately. So one of the dimensions is of course to talk about Ukraine in many different countries. So we have scholars in Latin America who say, well, we need actually Ukrainian studies, we need somebody to teach Ukrainian history in our countries. But I think it's very important to have, you know, lecturers on Ukrainian history, Ukrainian culture, not only in Latin America, but also in Central Asia, in many different parts of the world. But also, I think it is very important to have, you know, Latin American studies in Ukraine. It is also very important to have Central Asian studies or North Caucasus studies in Ukraine. So it's not only Ukraine as one of the kind of, and it's true for any country of the world, is that one of the things is not only to revise narratives, colonial narratives that we've learned and that we are sometimes unconsciously using, such as the concept of Russia, but also to become knowledge producers and to become kind of centers of knowledges where people can meet. Sometimes in some of the countries where there is no freedom of academia, and Ukraine is a free democratic country, where we can actually foster such scholarship as, for example, North Caucasus studies, right? And it doesn't, it's something that the world needs, and it's of course, there is a war in Ukraine, but Ukraine, because it's democratic, because it is open, it is a very safe space to hold a lot of decolonial conversations. And so there is a book, it's called Asia's Method, and there is an article, Eastern Europe's Method, and I say Ukraine should also be a method, because this is a safe space for people to meet from around the world, not in a former colonial metropole, where its knowledge production is contaminated with colonial discourses, with colonial concepts and colonial hierarchies. Ukraine is not a colonial metropole. It's a place where people can connect, where people can understand each other, because there is this experience of oppression. And I think it's a very, because this moment is already there, it's nothing to push for, because it will take place anyways, but it's something hopefully that one can think about, and something hopefully where we at this conference, where we are meeting informally, hopefully these connections will take place, because so far we had kind of Russian experts explaining Central Asia, explaining Ukraine, explaining Caucasus, and this needs to be changed, where, and I always say that, of course, people who were formerly or currently colonized by Russia understand Russia very differently. And actually, scholars and analysts and activists who've experienced Russia have a very different perspective on Russia, and that is very valuable, not only for us, but also for the whole world. Yes, so this is my first.
Thank you for making the input personal, and thank you for Ukraine as a metered approach. It's really valuable and needed right at the moment. Mr. Alim Aliyev, Alim, the floor is yours. You can share your inputs with us. Thank you.
Good afternoon, dear friends. It's an honor to be with you here and to speak to you. And, thank you for organizers and for all of you to come to Ukraine, to Kyiv, to support us on this very complicated times. I want to start with the topic of decolonization and recolonization in Ukraine. Today, Ukraine is going through these two opposite processes at the same time. When we talk about decolonization, we first of all talk about decommunization. In Ukraine, it means that we are getting rid of the totalitarian Soviet legacy, renaming cities and streets named after our executors, and developing our modern culture and also switching to the Ukrainian language where Russian was previously dominant. I call it reclaiming our own names. But the occupation of Ukraine territories is the opposite process. It's taking place, the process of recolonization. I want to briefly talk about Crimea and indigenous people of Ukraine, Crimean Tatars. Last 9.5 years, more than 5,000 cases of violation of human rights violations were fixed in Crimea. But it's only a tip of iceberg, because on the bottom we have this new colonization of the peninsula. And Crimea, after 2014, have become a role model for the colonization for another parts of Ukraine by Russia. And colonialism, for us, it's about appropriation or destruction. There is not third. Now I'm talking about our memory, I talk about our history, names, symbols, and of course people. Russian colonialism in relation to Crimean Tatars is when they first grab our language identity, after they grab our land, and then they even try to kill us. To talk about recolonization, it's important to take into historical context. During last 2,040 years, this is far from not the first attempt of colonization of Crimea. And we should start with two figures. Before the 1783, it was the first annexation of Crimea by Catherine II. 95% of all of population in Crimea were Crimean Tatars. Now it's dropped into 13%. And today the Russian propaganda, which tries to impose on the world the ancient ties between Crimea and Russia, focuses on the history after this first annexation of Crimea. And in such discourse, we haven't any place for example, Crimean Khanate, the Crimean Tatar statehood from the 1441. And for example, in 19th century, we have the situation when the Crimean Tatars is the first time when became more numerous abroad than in motherland in Ukraine. In 20th century, we had a deportation of Crimean Tatar, is a genocide in 1944, when all of Crimean Tatars were deported to Central Asia, to Siberia. For example, I was born in Uzbekistan, and all of Crimean Tatars' families has such the same history. And now I want to talk about modern colonization in three aspects. For example, identity. When we talked about identity, it means that violation of the right of self-determination of Crimean Tatar indigenous people in Crimea by Russia. We see ourselves as an integral part of Ukraine, of course. And in 2014, Russia tried to destroy our national institutions, like a Majlis of Crimean Tatar people. It's a banned institution in Russia, and also it's a banned institution in Crimea. And also we talk about, for example, cultural heritage. Destroying the tangible and intangible cultural heritage that does not fit into the Russian Kremlin ideology, as a hand palace in Bakhchisarai that destroyed under the guise of restoration, Or we talk about Crimean Tatar language. Today, it's Crimean Tatar language, one of the vanishing languages according to the UNESCO. And that's why, for example, parents in Crimea gathering to some, small groups at homes and teach Crimean Tatar language, mother language, for their own children. And one more, it's about religious identity. Today, Russian trying to focus on Crimean Tatars as a potential terrorists and extremists. That's why today we have a lot of prosecutions on these criminal articles. But for Crimean Tatars, for our history, nonviolent resistance is in our blood. If we talk about, for example, Soviet past. When we talk about second militarization, it's not only that Crimea, one of the main platforms for Russia to launch bombs and missiles to another part of Ukraine, but it's also and militarization of consciousness, but it's also forcing mobilization of the people from occupied territories. And Russia tried to, first of all, mobilize Crimean Tatars to Russian army. And such crime may lead to repeated act of genocide of Crimean Tatar people because Russia tried to send Crimean Tatars to the front line and fight against not only our land, our state, Ukrainian state, but also against Crimean Tatars who in Ukrainian army. And third dimension is settlement colonization. When we talked about internal displaced people, when we talk about refugees, it's near 70,000 people left Crimea during last 9.5 years. But we have a reserve trend when 700,000 people came to Crimea from Russia, and with different groups. It's not only military people, but it's also civilians and even pensioners and business persons who colonized Crimea. And that's why we have a short attempts of colonization. What's important when we talk about today is this decolonization and recolonization from the Crimean Tatar perspective. First of all, we should take a way not of victimizing ourselves, but to be competitive and to build horizontal ties with entire world. Secondly, it's in Crimea after the occupation, justice must prevail in the form of national territorial autonomy of Crimean Tatars, or because it's not a privilege for us, it's vital necessary to preserve our identity and preserve our nation as a equal nation in this world. And last but not least, when we talk about next plans for us, today we should talk about our homework. First of all, it's important to lead Crimean Tatar studies abroad in different universities, with the Ukrainian studies, of course. Today is the time when we not only talk about war, about human rights violations. Today is the time when we talk about ourselves, and today is the time when we give an answer to the question, who I am. And last is our common war. And in this war, a lot of Crimean Tatars, a lot of Ukrainians, a lot of people from different origins, or on front line in Ukraine army, or volunteering. And you know, it's not a war, first of all, for our land. It's war for our identity. It's war for our dignity. And it's war for our future. Thank you.
Thank you, Alim, for highlighting the Crimean Tatars colonial experience. And we are moving out of a region. We have two guests out of who made a very long trip to Ukraine. I really appreciate that they are joining us today. And I'm inviting Reverend Wompo to share your thoughts and reflection on coloniality and decoloniality with us. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. Indeed, it's a great privilege to be here. I would want to congratulate the organizers of this particular conference. To mention a few, Maria, Titania, and then Hope Co of the International Center for Ukrainian Victory. My first time in Ukraine is very impressive, excellent. I come from a country that happens to be the first African country to have attained independence in 1957 of Sif March. What I want to say is that coming from our part of the world, our forefathers fought for our decolonization. Our forefathers fought for our independence. It was not an easy task, but it was necessary. And I'm here to say that decolonization has become very necessary in this century because we have come to a stage where we can manage our own affairs. We have come to a stage where we don't need to be controlled or dominated over by another country anymore. Before I came to, Ukraine, the propaganda we have always heard, the stories we have always heard about Ukraine, coming here is a different impression altogether. And I must applaud the governance of Ukraine for standing the test of time. And I would continue to say that just keep up the fight. Ukraine does not deserve an attack. Ukraine does not deserve distraction. And I was excited when I heard the Prosecutor General yesterday when he gave us a brief of what the country is doing to book the accountability of people that are causing trouble, people that are perpetrating crime, and then people that have undermined human rights. And I tell myself that Ukraine has a future. Having come from a country that gained independence several years ago, I would speak from that perspective about the lessons of our past and challenges of our present. Indeed, ever since we gained independence, we have since, as an African nation, begun to manage our own affairs. It was not an easy task, but gradually, even though we are still a developing nation, but I think that we are heading towards a place that we can totally be independent of ourselves. Talking about decolonization, with our experience as Ghanaians, we could tell that we were not so much ready as at that time to be decolonized. Why am I saying this? Our colonial masters left us at a stage where, even though it was necessary for us to gain independence, but in a way, excuse me to say, we would have been better today if we had them in for some time. But in another way, it was very prudent and good that we gained independence because it didn't make us lose our culture. When we had the colonial masters in Ghana then, we were losing track with our tradition and our culture. They were destroying our culture, and then our educational curriculum was being destroyed. But having had an opportunity that our forefathers fought for independence, today I sit before you and I dress with a true identity of a Ghanaian and an African. Ladies and gentlemen, talking about challenges that we have from the perspective of Ghana, even though we fought to gain independence, but there is another modern colonization that is known as the neocolonialism. Why am I saying this? We still have our structures that are not strong, and as a result of that, we still have our colonial masters intruding in our economical affairs, intruding in our political affairs, and then, our religious and business affairs. So this time round, we are not being colonized like before, but we are colonized in an indirect form. Now, coming to Ukraine, I understand and feel the need for freedom in Ukraine. And I must say, today, a greater number of medical doctors in Ghana got scholarships to study in Ukraine, and today we are of benefit through that. And seeing the fact that today the aggressor, the attackers from Russia on Ukraine is rather unfortunate. It's unnecessary. And I sit down here to say that if we do not fight back, Russia in several years ago have built a precedent that is very bad. They keep on attacking and attacking. And if Ukraine does not rise to win the war, then Russia would continue to attack many more. We have a saying in Ghana that if your house is on fire, or your neighbor's house is on fire, and you sit at your home and you think that it doesn't concern you, don't forget, the next fire that is going to catch up is coming to your house. But I'm here to say that Ghana is not just sitting aloof. We are concerned about the victory of Ukraine. As a matter of fact, ever since Russia began the launch of its attack against Ukraine, our economy changed. Things became difficult. So in other words, the attack of Russia on Ukraine should be a matter of concern for all of us. Let's not have some particular people seated on the fence to feel that it doesn't concern them. It concerns all of us. In Ghana, we experienced an extravagant increment of food prices, fuel prices, and we have been suffering, even though we are not part of the war, even though we are not living in Ukraine or in Russia. That is to say that it should be a matter of concern to all of us, even in Africa, that our survival would always be dependent from Ukraine and other countries. So there is a great need for peace in Ukraine. And I've always said that I have fallen in love with Ukraine, and at any point in time I'm called upon to come to Ukraine, I would always be here to support Ukraine. Now, like the moderator said, I am a convener of a pressure group in Ghana that is Arise Ghana. And when we say Arise Ghana, we say Save Ghana Now. And I'm here to say, if I say Arise Ukraine, then you say Save Ukraine Now. Arise Ukraine. Arise Ukraine. Now, one other thing I want to say is that one of the ways that Ukraine can totally gain freedom or be decolonized is to be united. If you break your front, then you would have the enemy have control over you. I mean, over the news, I've heard of how your president, His Excellency Zelensky, even got into the battlefield. That is a true leader. That is a patriotic leader. Unfortunately, in our African continent, in times like this, you have the leaders rather hide and expect the citizens to go and fight. You have the leaders rather migrate their families to safer places and rather expect the citizens to fight. But in the case of Ukraine, it's so different because the leadership themselves are in the battlefield. That is to say that there is a great future for Ukraine. That is to say that people are willing to share their own blood to make sure that Ukraine is liberated, to make sure that Ukraine gains its freedom, to make sure that Ukraine stays united to fight against the oppressor. For how long can we continue to stay quiet and allow the oppressor intimidate us? For how long can we stay quiet and let other people think that they are above the law? I was glad, like I said yesterday, when I heard the steps that is being taken by the Prosecutor General on what they intend to do. I think that it is high time that all of us speak with one voice, that all of us come together and ensure that there is a peace in Ukraine, that all of us would ensure that Ukraine becomes victorious. So as a matter of fact, decolonization, as we see, talking about, the challenges, what I would encourage the good people of Ukraine is that you must put your structures right so that no one would have the capability and or the ability to be able to interfere in your systems of governance, like what is happening in our continent, Africa. Ukraine, I am very optimistic that this war would end with a victory for Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you for Ghana's wins, and thank you for comments on post-colonial identity and colonial structures. Mr. Mardiaga, the floor is yours, and really looking forward to hear from you.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me say how grateful I am for this invitation. My name is Felix Maradiaga. I am from Nicaragua. And this experience is surreal. I learned about the full-scale war in Ukraine while I was in complete isolation in a prison in Nicaragua. I did not have access to any information. And the guards were supposed to keep every information completely isolated. But one of my torturers, one of the Sandinista guards, felt very proud that he was trained by the Russians. And he felt very proud that accordingly to his version, Russia, the country that he admired, was winning the war and had invaded Ukraine, and he had in front of him an alleged CIA agent. And he was telling me, you know, you who are educated in the US and you have spoken at the UN Security Council and the European Parliament about all these things, and he heard my speeches condemning Russia when the invasion happened in 2014. And if someone would tell me that 6 months later, I would have been here talking to brave Ukrainian people to share my passion for freedom and my passion for a country that is showing the world what can happen when there is an entire nation that is deeply passionate about their land, about their principles, about the rights of the people. I would have never believed that. Thank you for that. And I've been asked to give a short statement, and I promise I will keep that to my time. Vladimir Putin's expansionist agenda has brought the issue of modern colonialism to the forefront, with reminders of its haunting presence from Crimea to Latin America. Recognizing the similarities between Russia's actions in Ukraine and the historical oppression witnessed in Latin America is essential. Despite Russia's claims against colonialism, a concealed agenda of colonial imperialism emerged by suppressing Ukrainian culture and identity even during the Soviet era. The contemporary struggle against modern imperialism requires us to comprehend this issue. Decolonization provides a way to rectify historical injustices and a mandate to build a world based on freedom and justice. Colonialism is a political system where a powerful nation or a group of nations takes control of foreign territories. At the same time, decolonization is the process by which formerly colonized territories seek to attain independence, sovereignty, and self-governance. Imperialism and colonialism share specific characteristics, such as centralized control, violence, an imperialistic mindset within the aggressor nation, and the forcible assimilation and distortion of national identities. These characteristics are evident in Putin's doctrine, also familiar to Russia in general. Russian propaganda has persistently claimed that Russia opposes colonialism. That is a lie. A typical scenario of colonial imperialism was unfolding behind the Iron Curtain. The annexation of Crimea and the ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine are stark examples of Russian expansionism. The debate on colonization and decolonization in the global south, particularly in Latin America, has been dominated by Marxist thought and outdated biases against the former European colonial powers. Moreover, the Soviet propaganda machine during the Cold War monopolized the conversation, leaving no acknowledgement of Russia's pre-Bolshevik imperial history or the Soviet imperialist actions during the Cold War. This is precisely why Russian propaganda has succeeded in Latin America, in Africa, and in the rest of the global south, relying on remnants of the Marxist narrative that blamed the West for colonialism while portraying the Soviet Union as a champion of decolonization. However, this narrative is inherently hypocritical and false. It is profoundly concerning that explaining Russian imperialism under Putin's dictatorship remains a formidable task in Africa, Latin America, and the rest of the global south. For those of us dedicated to providing objective information about the dangers of Russian expansionism, it has been a challenging and often isolating task, facing misunderstanding and opposition from significant segments of the progressive left. Furthermore, we confront another substantial challenge in countering and exposing Russian colonialism in its Latin American propaganda. Over the last 2 decades, even conservative elements in the global south have come to view Vladimir Putin as a strongman figure to emulate. In essence, proponents of liberal thinking like myself have consistently opposed figures like Putin and now find themselves confronting not only the traditional hypocrisy of the left in Latin America, but also the admiration of ultra-conservative factions who see Putin as a model strongman to follow. Russia's propaganda in Latin America traces its roots to the Soviet Union, the Castro regime in Cuba, the Chavistas in Venezuela, and the Sandinistas in Nicaragua are critical components of Russia's activities in the region. These contemporary authoritarian regimes adeptly manipulate democratic systems, employ selective repression, and maintain a facade of legality. They use advanced technology and political strategies to solidify their grip on society. Transnational ties among anti-Western dictatorships have solidified, forming an ecosystem of dictators providing financial support, sharing intelligence, and exchanging expertise on suppressing citizen, independent journalism, and stifling dissident. Decolonization should extend beyond a purely Marxist perspective to encompass a broader understanding that addresses contemporary forms of expansionism, such as Russia's under Putin. Recent developments, such as Cuba's alliance with Russia and the Ortega-Murillo regime in Nicaragua partnership with Putin, underscore the need for a democratic, global ecosystem to counter these new forms of imperialism while upholding the fundamental values of international law. As dictators forge a menacing web of tyranny, proponents of democracy must embrace transnational collaboration as a cornerstone of our resistance strategy against these novel imperialist forces. An urgent imperative is establishing a democratic global ecosystem to counter these new forms of imperialism. Thank you.
Thank you. And we are coming back to the region. Dr. Ilyasov, can you hear us? I would like to invite you to join us and share your thought with us. We can see you, we cannot hear you. Can you try to say something one more time? No, unfortunately, we cannot hear. Yeah, now we can hear you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for inviting me here, for having me today. It's my pleasure to be in this conference, and I regret that I'm not in person there. I've been asked to provide my analysis on Chechen perspective of decolonization, stating it from my positionality, from me being a Chechen scholar who left the country because of the wars that Russia waged against my people. And I want to start my talk with rhetorical question. And by the way, thank you very much for all previous speakers. And what I will be talking about very much is aligned with what they said before. So my question to the audience is, did you know that Chechnya and Chechens are colonial terms? They are. Chechens do not call themselves Chechens, nor do they call their republic Chechnya. However, colonial terminology became so widespread and accepted by the world that no one thinks about it differently. When I was doing my PhD, I tried to fight this. I tried to change it, and I failed because my voice was not heard in a choir of others, of much bigger chunk of other voices, Russian voices that imposed this terminology, and voices of other scholars who accepted it. So decolonization of scholarship is needed. I also was glad to see recent development in this sense, that Georgia previously called Georgia in Russian language, is now known as Sakartvelo in the world. I was happy to see that Kiev is written in a correct way. And this kind of gives me a hope that Chechnya will also become not Chechnya, but Ichkeria, Novchicho, or other names that Chechens want it to be. But honestly, today, I think that Chechnya and Chechens are correct term when we're referring to this geopolitical entity that exists right now under Russian occupation, because it is a colony. So that is today. But in 1990s, Chechnya was among the leaders of the decolonization process in the territory of former Soviet Union. Led by Jahar Dudayev, the first president of Chechnya, who was literally frontline decolonial politician and thinker, Chechnya declared its sovereignty in 1999. Dudayev, by the way, well before this professor, I didn't catch the name, but Botakos Kasimbekov mentioned him, who predicted this collision between Ukraine and Russia. Dudayev predicted this collision long before that, in early 90s. More than that, he clearly identified neo-imperial ideology that Russia adopted since early 90s, and he called it Russism, the modern and Russian version of fascism. That was his contribution to decolonization, to modern thinking. And after Chechens declared independence, they changed this colonial term Chechnya into Novchicho, which was for domestic audience in Chechen language, and Ichkeria for international audience. What Chechens tried to achieve with declaring this independence was pretty much the right to decide their own fate, to use their own language, to have their distinct identity. And this was unique to the territory of Russian Federation. No other nation wanted to achieve the same things by declaring full sovereignty, by claiming it. Why? Why no other nation tried to do so? The thing is that Chechnya was fighting its fight anti-Russian empire for 200 years, even more. Same as some of the previous speakers identified the long-term Ukrainian fight against imperialism. Chechens suffered the genocidal deportation, same as Crimean Tatars. In 1994, the whole entire nation was deported to Central Asia and lost almost half of its population. My family of my grandparents was deported to Kyrgyzstan. They lived in Talas region, and they lost also several members of its family. It was not allowed to speak about it. It was not allowed even to know about it. So another colonial frame that was imposed on the Chechen nation, that they do not have the right to have their own history. And even under these circumstances, Chechens managed to resist imperialism, even in deportation. And another factor that also pushed Chechens to this fight, to this forefront of the fight against Russian imperialism, neo-imperialism, is the feeling that Russia always inflicted on Chechens of being second-hand citizens who are not allowed to have their own customs, who are not allowed to speak their own language. Interestingly enough, today, Ivan Kadyrov, who is the Russian's Russian interlocutor in Chechnya, who rules Chechnya on behalf of Russia, even him, when he speaks in Chechen language, he acknowledges it. So in my mind, what the world could have learned from this Russo-Chechen interaction, from the history of it, is that Russian government and nation, and not only government, not only politician, they have imperial mindset. Even so-called liberals, they deny Chechen sovereignty. Just to remind you, remember Khodorkovsky when right away after serving 10 years in Russian prison, in one of his first interviews, he stated that he is ready to protect Russian unity and fight Chechen separatism with guns in his arms. That's a leader of Russian liberal opposition. The second lesson that the world could have learned from Russo-Chechen interaction is that success of recolonization Chechnya, the second war that happened in 2000, it encouraged Russia to make an attempt to recolonize Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine since 2014. It was not seen by the world back then that it is recolonization in Chechnya. It was not seen by the world that Chechnya is trying to get rid of this status of being a colony. And it was not seen that Russia is denying sovereignty, not only of the units who were thrown into being a part of Russian Federation, but also other post-Soviet nations, same as who are internationally recognized, such as Ukraine or Georgia. So I think that Ukraine's victory in war will help decolonization effort, that it will free those who are currently under occupation, who live in the colonies of Russia, as the colonies of Russia, who suffer from the dominant narrative in Russia that instills false memories and false understanding of history. I think it is important to disrupt this Russian-centric understanding and imaginary of people who are in fact colonized. So therefore, I think that Ukraine's victory will be people's victory, not only Ukraine's, but all other peoples too who are colonized today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Ilyasov. Thank you, all of you. I really, really appreciate how many we have in common, and I hope our panel will contribute a lot to mutual understanding, colonial experience, as well as decolonial intentions. I wish we had the whole day to discuss the issue, because I have really a lot of topics and questions noted, but we are running out of time. Nevertheless, I propose to have a short, a very brief Q&A section, probably for a few questions to our panelists. You will be the first, and then you can pass the mic.
Thank you. First of all, before I ask my question, I would like, as a Ukrainian born in Sevastopol, Crimea, I would like to thank all of you for coming here and for showing this amazing support that we have from all of the world, from all corners, from South America, Central America, from Africa, from Middle East, Asia and Oceania. It is incredibly important and inspiring to see that despite what we see in the media, you're here and you're supporting us. And this means all the world to us. Thank you very much. And now as to my question to the panelists. Thank you very much for giving your perspectives. And when we are trying to understand why does the world perceive Russia as it perceives, like through Dostoevsky, and not through the war criminals that come and commit genocide. One of the things that often pops up is the so-called blue water thesis, or the salt water fallacy, which was adopted in 1950s during the decolonization approaches of the United Nations, according to which the United States and the Soviet Union opposed decolonization processes which would happen and affect their countries. And they invented that it's only a colonial empire if it goes across the salt water, across the ocean. That way, they evaded responsibility, and now we see that Russia is not perceived as a colonial power, even though it has more than 100 nationalities, such as Nokhcho there, the representative of whom we have the honor to have here. So the question to you is, how can we decolonize the Russian studies? How can we demonstrate that saltwater fallacy is unacceptable? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I propose to have one answer, to have more questions. Who would like to answer this question? I will invite you to answer this question. Yes.
Okay, I'll go ahead.
Yeah.
Very quickly. I think that the roots of this propaganda, because there's no other word for that, are the Soviet era. And when we tackle into that issue, I think that it's more than a technical issue from international law, it's an issue of political thought. And the only way that I can imagine, and I know that we don't have much time to go into details, but it's basically information. We need to organize a very sophisticated network of informers, people from academia, from private sector, from international civil society, to basically tackle this issue, because the level of disinformation is deeply rooted. And when the Soviets collapsed, many of these ideas survived with very well intentions, I would say, within, for example, the social democrat political vision. So anytime that you criticize these type of issues, you're perceived as pro-imperialistic or pro-United States, and it's just a level of disinformation. So I know that my response might seem simplistic, but I think that the core of issue is disinformation. And disinformation can only be fought through a combination of academia, public intellectuals, civil society, responsible media, and activists working together on a narrative that is easy to digest for the new generation of thought leaders around the world.
Dr. Ghosh, would you like to add something briefly?
Very briefly. Yes, academically, I fully agree with you. It is all working together. Politically, it is the left which should completely review their ideology. Complete overhaul of the left ideology is needed. It's very deep topic which we cannot even open because it's Pandora's box. And its alignment with the Soviet type of left ideology, which started with Bolshevik and then continues till today. The second is diplomatically. We need to put an end to the bipolar world. As long as the bipolar world will exist, we will have this. You know, it is not a one-sided game also. We have accepted what Soviet Union did so that it happened like that, and we shouldn't accept what Russia is doing. So that is up to the political will of the other side. Thank you.
Thank you. And are you willing to answer, or should we? We can ask for more questions here. Any more questions? Yes, can you pass the mic, please? Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much to all the panelists for very inspiring, indeed, speeches and many insights. You partly touched upon the topic of different peoples, indigenous people, basically blocked within Russian empire today. So I'd like to hear your opinion how we can boost the process of decolonization for these peoples, for example, for Kazakhstan, for Ichkeria's people, because today we can see that more and more international platforms like this one are being created, where people from different nations can talk more and represent decolonization opinion on their nations. And there are more parliamentary initiatives in Ukraine being established on the same topic. But my question is how deeply we can involve in this process, but at the same time how we can help these nations to boost the decolonization process. Thank you very much.
Well, that's a very good question. Well, first of all, one cannot decolonize others. One can only decolonize oneself, and that's very important to understand, because anytime one tries to decolonize others, one is in a colonial project, and this is it's a very important argument because this is what kind of Moscow leaders were saying: we are decolonizing others. You cannot decolonize anyone else except for yourself. In Kazakhstan, decolonization is a big topic now for at least 10 years. It's nothing new. It was fostered by artists, activists, cultural people from cultural sphere, academics. We have books writing on decolonization. My sister told me that she was a year ago. She said that she was in a supermarket and a cashier asked her, "So what do you know about decolonization?" So it's really everywhere. It's a very important topic. In Kazakhstan, it's really different layers of society are engaged into that. We really have books on that and publishers, etc. But in Kyrgyzstan, for example, so some of my colleagues, Kyrgyzstan is losing its democracy, almost lost its democracy now, and it's a very dangerous topic. So sometimes people think that people in the colonies can talk about decolonization because they experienced it. Actually, it's not true. For example, it's in kind of dictatorial context, it's very dangerous. So people, so for example, just to give you an example that happened recently, a Kyrgyz student wanted to write his master's thesis about decolonization. It's something with clothing or language. You know, it's something that wasn't overly directly political, but his professors who actually came from Russia, they disqualified his master's thesis because they said that it's an expression of nationalism. He made a big social media campaign, and then he could defend his master's thesis on decolonization. So even when people, professors talk about decolonization, they are being targeted by the government because they think it is a very dangerous topic. So for them, it's not safe. In Kyrgyzstan, it's not safe for them to talk about decolonization, but it is safe for them to talk about decolonization with outside of Kyrgyzstan. So Ukraine is really, because it is democratic, because it is free, because, I mean, freedom of speech and freedom of thinking, this is exactly decolonization, and when Ukraine wanted to have its story, it was punished for that. You know, it's still being punished for decolonization. But that's why I strongly believe in the fact that Ukraine is a platform for these kind of conversations. The only thing that one can do is really being a platform, but one cannot decolonize others. However, being a platform, welcoming, but also you know, really have a different mode of, you know, thinking and co-learning and thinking that we learn from each other. We're not simply teaching. I think that decolonial mindset of academic exchange is very important. From my experience working in European universities, I must say that the curriculum is very Eurocentric in Europe. So at history departments, it's mostly very Eurocentric. Ukraine is in a very unique position of actually being a European country, but because of its experience with colonialism, actually be a platform, be a political kind of platform, not like politicized platform, but be an open platform to attract and provide forums like this for people to, because there are not so many, actually, there are not so many places in the world where this can take place, because of anti-Americanism and anti-Westernism, sometimes people feel that maybe Washington or maybe, London is not the best place to talk about certain issues, but Ukraine is, and it's a very unique position, and I think I've heard from a lot of academics, they dream of coming to Ukraine. They really want to be here. It's nothing that one needs to impose. It's simply, it doesn't even need a lot of effort, actually, because it is already there. And yes, if, for example, in places like Kazakhstan, right now we have also artists and intellectuals also from Tatarstan, from Bashkortostan, who are actually engaged into this conversation. They're producing new terms, they're producing new theories, new ways of understanding kind of the region. So one just needs to connect and to foster this and listen, also really listen to people.
Thank you. Dr. Ilyasov, you want to add something briefly?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for these questions as well. They're very similar. They sounded very similar to me, both of them. And the answers that were given before me are actually really brilliant. And I wanted to add very small things. Yes, formation is the first thing that is the most important. That it should compete Russian overwhelming flow of information which actually instills and imposes its colonial frame. Ukraine, what it can, it can compete with Russia because of the size of the country, because of the power, because it has say, and the world is listening to it now. What it can do the best, it can win the war. That would help a lot for other peoples to decolonize themselves. We can do the rest. What Ukraine also and Ukrainian scholars could do also to help to change this terminology I was talking about, that the world would start seeing other people not as indigenous to Russia, but as indigenous to their own region. So Chechens are not indigenous to Russia; they're indigenous to North Caucasus, to this territory, and understanding of this would and promotion of this kind of terminology, disrupting this narrative that that is right, that Russian academia still tries to push, even those who fled the country and who position themselves as anti-regime, anti-Putin, and everything like that. But they still have the different mindset, the mindset that is still imperial. That's what I was trying to emphasize with my example of Khodorkovsky. It's not only Khodorkovsky. Many Russian scholars are like this. So, so Ukraine, being a big country, having a huge potential, having a lot of scholars, and having a say, I think it can help small people to have a push to move towards their own decolonization. Thank you.
Thank you. And unfortunately, we are running out of time.
Sorry.
And
very brief and very. I try to combine.
Can you conclude?
Answer the question. I try to combine two questions and say that first of all, we should be subjects when the issue is about ourselves. We should be not on the table. We should be at the table. And we should develop or create our own institutions. And it's very important, this institutional works. And second, when we talk about cultural academia, let's change the mindset. We haven't any great Russian culture. Our single culture is great and unique for us. and let's just open our own culture for us and open in cultures of another nations. Read writers from Kazakhstan, from Ghana, from Brazil, etc., etc., etc. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Reverend Wombo, can I ask you for a brief 1-minute conclusion to our panel, if you would like? Thank you. Yeah, just briefly conclusion to our panel to inspire us to meet one more time and to talk on this issue more detail. Thank you.
Yes. With regards to the question from the lady, the process of decolonization can only commence when the citizens of the very country that is being colonized comes to a realization that it's high time they become independent of themselves. There isn't any way out that another country can begin to boost the process of decolonization for another country. If you do that, then you are indirectly attracting enmity from one country to your country. So basically, the process of decolonization would only commence when the country that is being decolonized comes to a realization that it is high time we become independent of ourselves and we can manage our own affairs without anybody ruling us. We have a saying in Ghana that he who wears the shoe knows exactly where it is pinning. So you, the one that is colonized, you would know what you are going through, and you should rise up to decolonize yourself before you can gain support.
A small quotation from a person respected by Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars and Mahatma Gandhi said that the doors and the windows of my home must always be open, so that all the cultures would come, and so that we would be able to talk calmly, and so that we would be standing strong. We need to be standing strong so that the guests would come to us, not to occupy us, and so that we would not be swept with the wind. Thank you.
Thank you all, thank you participants, thank you our audience, and I want to remind you that we are going to gather in the lobby upstairs to visit one more special event. Thank you one more time.
Dear guests, just to emphasize